You, it says it is. But we're early. Huh? Should I be talking? We will get started with our program in about 7 minutes. After I possibly sneeze. Hmm? I don't know how to see the viewers, so I can't tell you. Oh, good. So now we won't be looking quite as dorky right now. That's like crazy. They should have it so that you don't have to be quite live yet. I can turn the mic off. Yes, I do need you to give me those numbers. That was from last month. I think I have to enter them separately. Oh, you didn't have any prior sent questions, right? Okay, just double checking. I can hear that. So we're going to wait about another 4 more minutes for people to log in if you're going to watch this program live. So about another, I guess, 3 minutes now as I look at my clock. Feel free, if you do have questions, to go ahead and enter them in the chat that we can have ready for when we do start the program. So if you're just now joining us, we're going to get started right about at noon today, talking about putting your gardens to bed. If you do have any questions, I do see there is one already that I will answer. You can go ahead and start putting those kinds of questions in the comment field as soon as you are ready. So we have about another 1 minute, and then we will start the live stream of putting your gardens to bed. Again, if you are just now joining us, if you do have any questions, feel free to put them into the comment area, and I'll make sure to answer them during the program. Well, I do see that it actually, by my clock, is officially noon. So I'm going to go ahead and start the program for today. So I am here at Gabis Arboretum, and we are broadcasting a Facebook Live event. I am Nikky Witkowski with Purdue Extension in Porter County. I work as their A&R Extension Educator in that office. Today we're going to talk about putting your garden to bed. So things that you need to consider and do during this time of the year, although we've already had a couple freezes. But this is things that you can consider and do to basically get ready for winter. Because I think it is a good launching point, we did have someone ask, are there any other winter flowers besides dahlias that I need to uproot and winter over, I'm assuming? So yes, there can be other flowers that you may need to uproot and winter over in the house. And those can be especially cannas. So to me, they're the ones that look like big, large corn stalks with beautiful flowers coming out of the top, and they can have really nice foliage as well. But those definitely need to be uprooted, as well as the gladioluses are one of the other common ones that the gladiolus ones do not necessarily overwinter in our gardens well. So you do need to make sure you track back and what flowers did you have or do you have that don't overwinter well, that do need to come in and be winter protected. So, make sure you do evaluate your garden as soon as possible on that, because again, we've already had a couple freezes, and while those plants would probably tolerate the freezes that we had, you definitely don't want them to be in your garden over winter and things like that. Also, just to go ahead and handle that, because it can be a great segue. So when we're looking at the flowers and plants in our gardens, another question about raspberry plants, cut them back, don't cut them back now. Most of your herbaceous ornamental plants, so we were just talking about our flowers. When you're talking about when or if I cut them back, that can be a really interesting discussion topic. If they are things like your hostas and annual plants that will completely die back to the ground and have no stalk staking and things like that are left overwards, you can go ahead and cut those and clean those up. The earlier you clean up depends upon, did you have any insects and disease problems? Especially on your annuals, if you had insect and disease problems, you want to clean those up as soon as you can. And that is the same as true for your herbaceous plants. So for example, if you had peonies, and your peonies actually had a problem, with either powdery mildew or peony leaf blotch, definitely clean those up as fast as possible, because the more they're left to be there and deteriorate and go bad, the longer they're left there, the more inoculum or fungal properties will actually stick around for next year. So you are better off, yes, clean it up as early as you can to remove any of that infectious inoculum for the upcoming year. If you didn't have problems, then some of that can overwinter a little bit and stay and might even decompose and benefit the environment a little bit. But definitely make sure you're watching out for plants that have insect and disease issues. When it comes to plants that are herbaceous that create a stem, so an example given in the chat was raspberries, or I'm going to say things like lilies or sedums that are sometimes also called live-forevers. They have a tall stem that is left above the ground, or even certain hydrangeas, even though most of those, are woodies and stay back. If you have plants like that, that becomes a decision call up to you. So reasons to leave them up. It can look really pretty over the winter time to have those flower heads maybe left. If you have things like some native bees, there are a lot of native bees or insects that are good insects that like to make homes in stalks and canes. If you have those, they would love to overwinter or make homes in those stalks and canes over winter time. So that can also be another valuable reason why to leave some of those canes up, at least for now. You do need to hopefully remove them by about the February-March timeframe, but you can at least leave them up for now. If you wanted to take them all down now, I would recommend for most of those plants that you actually cut them and you cut them 2 to 3 inches above the ground surface. The reason why is that if you try to yank them out of the ground, some of them, especially like the showy stone crops, or maybe some of the bulbs, if you yank it out of the ground and you hurt the plant that it came from, so if you pull that bulb and maybe break roots, or you pull that live-forever and get pieces of that showy stone crop coming out with the cane that you yanked, you obviously damaged at least what you pulled out, but you also probably damaged what's there. And by damaging it, you may get winter injury the next year because of that damage. So that's why if you are going to cut things back, make sure that you are doing it carefully in the fall, and you still may need to be a little bit cautious in the spring, but be careful. Now, the one thing I want to address about the raspberries, especially when it comes to cutting those canes, keep in mind that they are what is called a biennial cane. So year one, it's going to come up and it's going to get all kinds of leafiness, and that's where we can summer tip them and get them all branchy. But then the cane is going to fade, or at least the leaves are going to fade, but then next year is when that will come up and flower and fruit. So when you're cutting the raspberries, keep in mind that most raspberries, it takes 2 years for that cane to fruit. Sometimes you might get a third year out of a cane. You can tell usually if you are or you're not, because the cane will turn brown if it's not going to survive. But you might get a third year. But if the cane is brown, excuse me, if the cane is brown, then you can go ahead and trim it back even right now, or you can do it in the spring. So again, watch out, because we don't want to blanketly cut the whole patch down, only the canes that aren't going to survive. Now, all of that goes out the window depending on which raspberry, or I'm going to also throw in blackberry because they're the exact same. All of that goes out the window depending which variety you bought. There are some that are called primocane fruiting. So what I didn't say in my initial explanation that I will say now is that the initial cane that comes up, the first year it comes up, is called a primocane. And like I said, the first year, it grows all vegetatively. Meaning it's only going to leaf out. You're not going to get any fruits and flowers on it. But if you get a primocane fruiting type, that first year it will flower. And then it may or may not survive the second year. So know what type you have. The other general guideline is if you can see the leftovers of the fruits on that, you know it flowered and fruited that year. So you know you can cut those canes down. But again, like I said, yeah, you can choose, cut it down now or later, but just be very cautious that if you have some of them that are not primocane fruiting, so not fruiting that first year, if you cut those down as well, you're going to lose all your fruit for next year. So make sure you're very observant about what you do and don't plant, especially in northern Indiana. We do recommend that you have, if you're going to have a blackberry, have a primocane fruiting blackberry, because in northern Indiana, they don't survive as well over winter. Raspberries, primocane fruiting is not necessary in the northern part of the states. You can get them, but they're just not as necessary as for the blackberries. The southern part of the state, that's where raspberries, you might consider primocane fruiting. Sometimes they just have a little more trouble for some reason down in that area. So those are definite things to consider. And again, like I said, it's going to be that you have to make sure, is the cane actually dead or not? And that's why sometimes it's almost easier to kind of look for it in the spring rather than now. But again, you can choose and see which one works better for you. So since I am right now currently talking about some of our fruit crops, I will kind of continue with those. So we talked about our raspberries and our blackberries. If you have other fruit crops like grapes or your apples and your pears, things like that, things that you would want to obviously consider with those is definitely do your final evaluation. What problems did I have? What might I need to consider next year? And start thinking about that so that you know what you may need to watch out for next year, because maybe not all the leaves have fallen and we can therefore evaluate those plants. The other thing to do is that if you have cherries or some of those that are in that kind of a family, you might want to be doing a check for black knot. It is a disease that causes a large blackened canker on the stem that would just kind of look like a large eruption on the stem, down the stem, kind of like, my finger's thin, that's the initial stem, but yet you have my fist that is larger. That's black knot that grows on the stem. That is a fungal organism that can strangle the stems. If you have any of it, the wintertime right now would be a great time to remove those knots whenever you can. Sometimes it's not possible because it grows on too large of a branch, but whenever you can, you do want to remove those off the tree to help prevent future infections. That disease can get really rampant really fast, and in the wintertime is the best time to see them because you don't have the leaves. You can clearly see all the stems of the plant. So again, a great time to evaluate them and look at them. I will mention, because we were talking about basically pruning and cutting things off, if you are doing that, it is not a requirement that you have to do the wound paint or pruning paint on them. Cutting them this late in the year isn't always recommended because it can hurt their dormancy. But when we're talking about disease issues, then that's when we have to sometimes say we're wanting this as an acceptable possible loss because we're trying to do it for the benefit of the tree. Or if you had a peach tree maybe that was too heavily laden this past year, maybe it had a broken branch. Well then yes, cut it now, because having it damaged over wintertime is not going to benefit the tree at all. So do those sort of cleanup things of removing diseases and broken branches. Wait to do the actual pruning. So the actual, structural pruning to help change a tree or, lessen the branches. Do those pruning changes in about the February, March time frame. That's usually a much better time frame to work with those trees in, because again, if you trim them too much right now, you may actually you may actually cause them to pull out of dormancy more. So looking on some other fruits, let's see, other things that you might consider with those. I guess I did mention the diseases. That's what I wanted to go back to. Some of those diseases are harbored in the leaves, so whenever you can, do go back and actually try to either remove the leaves or at least, mesh them up as good as you can. If you compost, make sure you compost them, because we're thinking if they may have diseases. If you wanted to compost them right, or don't put them back near those trees. Composting them right means it has to get to a high temperature and be turned to a certain frequency of a schedule, or else you don't kill off that disease and you're just going to mulch them again with the diseases, and it'd been like you'd done nothing for them in the past. So moving on with the fruits, unless we get some more questions about fruits, I'm going to kind of go back now to our ornamental plants, and definitely keep the questions coming as we do have them. It's all right if it's one person or several people asking questions. But some questions on, basically how do we protect, or what do we do for some of our winter plantings? So keep in mind, I want to go with first. We've gotten the question, is it too late to still plant bulbs? Or I'll say any other plants. Yes and no. So it is too late if you don't want to run the risk of losing it still. The problem with planting late in the year is the fact that if you don't get all the holes of digging it up, if you don't get all those holes filled in well, the cold air will get down to the root ball still, and it will kill the roots, or the plant just doesn't have time to establish over winter and develop its own root system so that it can survive the winter. That's the risk you run, especially when we're talking about bulbs, because the bulb may grow a little bit right now, put down some roots, but it's going to basically be resting right now until the next year. So again, it's the coldness going into it that's going to be a problem. If you still want to plant, you just need to make sure that you heavily mulch them. What I mean by heavily mulch, usually I'm going to tell you mulches should only be about 1 inch to maybe 2 inches thick. But if you planted something new, we want to mulch it where it can be as high as 3 to 4 inches high, because again, we need them covered so that air doesn't get down to the roots of that plant to harm it. So we may, cover them, again, 3 to 4 inches of mulch, and we want to make sure we water them very well. The mulch, I forgot, should also be, if you planted like here and it's this wide of a pot, like 3 or 4 inches wide, make sure you mulch past that. So if you disturb the soil, you want to mulch past where you disturb the soil. So if you only dug like, 3 or 4 inches because maybe it was a bulb, then mulch 4 to 6 inches out. And it can be mounded. It doesn't have to be 3 to 4 inches the whole way. The point, again, is just to kind of give it a nice winter blanket. So keep that in mind when you are, planting plants still, to do that. Now, a question came up of, squirrels, devouring bulbs. Unfortunately, some of our mammals are just so annoying that they just don't appreciate what we want to plant for the future. And yes, you're going to have things like squirrels and voles that will try to sometimes cause problems. If it is something like a squirrel causing a problem with your bulbs, what I would basically recommend is that obviously you can try to put more of a mulch layer on it, or maybe even put something temporarily over where the bulbs are. This could be anything like a solid surface, like a board, so they obviously can't dig down and get it. Or it could be something that has sort of like a mesh to it, like a chicken wire, something like that, that is at least skinny enough they can't dig into it. But if you are not sure if you're going to get to it next year, make sure it's also wide enough. So maybe like a 2 by 2 inch or 1 by 1 inch. But just keep in mind, like I already did state, whatever you do to protect them, make sure you undo it in the spring, or you're going to have a problem when they're trying to come up and still kind of defeat the purpose. Now, the other critter I did mention, though, is a vole. And some of you may not have heard of a vole before, but vole is kind of a mixture looking almost of a field mouse, or I'm sorry, it's sometimes called a field mouse, but it's kind of a mixture of a looking of like a mouse and a mole put together, which to me is how they get a vole. But what a vole is that it's a little creature that will burrow in the mulch. It uses a shorter tail than a mouse, and it has more mouse-like ears. But again, it likes to live underground when it can. What voles will typically do is they will actually occupy the tunnels of a mole, and that's how they may gain access to your bulbs. If something like that's a problem, then yeah, you're going to have to do some sort of underground caging or fencing in order to prevent them from burrowing up next to your bulbs or other plants to cause a problem. Thinner layers of mulch also help. So again, when I went back to say, only an inch thick layer of mulch, well, yeah, the thinner it is, the less likely you're going to have any of those little critters, including mice sometimes, in the mulch causing problems. So again, another proponent of why, we say 2 inches of mulch at an absolute max, except for winter mulching, which is a whole different set of situations. Otherwise, that's why we say go on the lesser side. 1/2 inch to 1 inch is usually okay to have in a mulch. So keep that in mind, that yes, we do want to try to mulch with discretion, because mulch is great, but too much causes problems, including, it can cause problems with even just trying to have some of that water naturally getting into the soil. So when we're talking again about, because we went back to flowering plants, the other things just again to keep in mind are just to kind of watch what was successful and what wasn't maybe this past year. By knowing that, you know maybe what to plan for next year. If a flower was not successful, we need to evaluate. Was it that specific type of that flower? Was it because I had it in the wrong place and it just didn't like it? So I need to consider a whole different kind of flower. Did it have a disease or an insect problem? But again, like I said, you need to make sure you're kind of watching for that. So evaluate what went good and what went bad in your garden so that way, again, you can make a plan. Because I was just talking about mulch, I'm going to go back. Somebody asked, tell me what should be in my mulch. So a mulch can be anything. It can be what I will call organic, which by an organic mulch, I mean wood chips, shredded bark, cocoa hulls. It can be even straw. It doesn't necessarily matter what you use of an organic mulch. Just keep in mind what you put down, what kind of quality is it. So usually when we get things like a bark mulch or a hardwood mulch, those are pretty, I'm going to call it clean, because they're not going to have usually very many weed seeds and things like that in it. Whereas if we did something like a straw mulch with straw, it could bring wheat seeds into it, or it could bring weed seeds into your beds the following years. So be cautious about that and what you are obviously bringing into your, garden with what mulch you bring. Now, again, like I said, I was saying that was on the organic side of, it basically came or was from a living type of an organism, so some sort of a tree or plant or things like that. You can do an inorganic mulch, which would basically be like rocks, rubber mulch, anything else like that you do enjoy. You can do those, when you're talking about, a winter mulching aspect. I don't know that you really want to pile rocks 3 to 4 inches high that you would then have to dig back in the following year. You might do something else, like some sort of other cover or something like that to help those instead. But a mulch can be any of those combinations that you desire to use. All right, so I want to go ahead and go to another question that was also asked about pruning trees and shrubs. I'm going to say what kind of rules and regulations, or not regulations, but rules and recommendations are there. So the number one rule is if it is sick, diseased, or going to cause harm, don't care, trim it. It doesn't matter what time of the year it is. You can prune at any time of the year. It's not going to kill your plant. It may suffer a little bit of a setback. So it may not, grow as well next year, or you may get some die back from that point from where you trimmed it. But again, if it's going to be something that is diseased, like the black knot that I mentioned, cut it out. If it is broken, cut it out. If it's at risk of causing harm to people or to property, cut it out. It's at risk. So you do want to still go ahead and do that sort of pruning, regardless. Now, with that said, when the best time of the year to prune, as a general rule, a better time of the year to prune is going to be usually more like in the springtime, or I'm going to say late spring, maybe early summer, because some trees are what they call bleeders. Because like if you hear of like having the maple running in the spring, yeah, if you trim a maple tree in the spring, it may actually leak sap more so in the spring, and it's called bleeding. It may bleed in the spring, so if you prune it, maybe later spring than earlier spring, you're not going to get as much bleeding, but regardless, it's not going to hurt it. It just is going to bleed until it finally kind of stops, just like what we do. So generally it's in the spring. However, if you have a flowering shrub or tree, it could apply to that too. The rule for those is to prune it after it flowers. So for example, a lilac is a spring blooming tree. If you prune that in March, you will actually prune out all the blooms, because it actually, since it blooms, I'm going to say April, May timeframe, it sets its blooms like during the summer, and they overwinter. And so if you cut them off in March, or if you trim it wrong in March, you just cut off all the blooms that came on during that whole time frame. So prune it after it flowers. So if you wanted to prune a lilac, prune it in like the May during the summertime, or May or late May, right after it actually has finished blooming. Now there are other plants, and I'm just going to groupingly say hydrangeas. Some are spring bloomers, so follow the spring blooming rule, but there are as many also that bloom late summer and through the fall. And if they're one of those ones that blooms in the fall, we can leave those blooms up clear to maybe March and trim them off, right before they start coming out, because they're not doing a lot then. But you definitely don't want to prune them late summer, because otherwise, again, you're going to prune off all their blooms. So that's why I say, springtime can be nice, but the otherwise general rule is that if it is a flowering tree, shrub, prune them after they bloom, so that way you have better luck. Now, the only other one that I'm going to pick on of a blooming time and pruning is going to be our lovely roses. Roses are awesome. They're really cool. Yes, again, they do need to be pruned after they flower, so that way, if you're wanting to control the shape, you prune them after flowering, so that way you kind of control the shape then, so that you don't necessarily cut off the flowers. But when it comes to overwintering them, some of them need to be in cones, or have some sort of a winter protection of either a blanket or something else. But bottom line, sometimes they need extra winter protection. Well, sometimes they grow too much and you can't cover them. So sometimes, yes, on a rose, you may have to prune it in the fall to prepare it for overwintering. And that's fine, because again, it's trying to benefit the health of the rose or get a bigger cover. But keep in mind, I would never prune a rose at this time of the year harder than you have to, because roses also tend to need a little bit of trimming again after winter, it seems like, because they usually have maybe a little bit of winter dieback, regardless if you trim them or not. So don't prune them harder than you have to get them to fit into your winter protection method you use. Don't prune them harder than you have to, because you still may have to do some cleanup pruning in the spring as well. So that is one thing to keep in mind with roses, is that yes, they can be a little bit finicky in that respect. All right, so I think I have caught up on questions, but if there are more, please still keep entering them, or if you had one that I don't see, do put it back in again so that I can get to it. So I'm going to, though, move on some other wintering things of putting your garden to bed to think about. So one other big thing that we haven't talked about yet that is involving your garden that you may want to consider to do is actually going to be irrigation and watering. So keep in mind, do you have an irrigation system? If so, have you blown the water out of it? So you need to make sure it's, disconnected from the water supply, so that at least it's not getting more water. And then you may have to hook up like an air compressor to it and blow out. So, go through the zones and blow them out until you're getting more air than water coming out. If you don't do this, they will freeze. They're not below a frost line, which is normally accepted as 3 feet here. They're not below that frost freeze line in the ground. At least the lines of it aren't. So you do need to make sure that you are blowing them out, so that way you can actually make sure your lines are saved for the following year on the main lines. Now, maybe you have a hose that is a drip hose, that it's not an irrigation hose necessarily we can blow out. But obviously, if you have those, 2 options: either blow them out too, so that way they don't, freeze over winter, or lift them up and basically, get the water to run out them. Hoses in general, obviously, yes, they either need to be picked up or drained. So simply, I just take mine and, lift it up over my head and just kind of go down the line of the hose and drain it that way. And sometimes I might leave them out over winter in case I have some sort of a plant, like some of our evergreens, that I need to water over winter. I might do that, because after I'm done watering, I'm just going to do the same trick again to, get most of the water out of the hose and call it good. But we need to make sure we get the water out and or bring them inside so that way they won't freeze. If they're in an unheated garage, you are still going to want to make sure they are water free before you put them away. Same thing is true with buckets, watering cans, or anything else, bird baths. All of that is true that we need to make sure we get all the water out. Now, granted, keep in mind, I did also say that some plants do need water over wintertime, like our evergreens, or I mentioned early on in the program that if you planted late, so if you've already been planting in the month of October, maybe even in September a little bit, those plants do need to be watered through, a good hard freeze that we have, as well as if it gets warm enough that the ground kind of unfreezes a little bit and it's been dry where we haven't had a lot of snowfall, it's not going to hurt to water them again during the winter time. So keep that in mind when you're putting your things to bed. Obviously, a great time to find all of your tools and your buckets, and a great time to start evaluating them. Do I need some new ones for next year? Do I need to get my pruners out and maybe do a good clean on them? Maybe do a sharpening on pruner blades so that way, or any cutting blade, so that way I won't cause damage by dull blades the following year. As well as it's a good time to oil them. Some gardeners even may leave their products in, meaning their pruning products, may even leave them in a light oil solution all winter long. That kind of might get a little grimy and nasty, but that is an option that you can consider. But again, like I said, oiling them for the next year is a good idea, or definitely, finding out now if you need something is a good idea. Also a good time to start thinking about, even though we're not putting our mowers away yet, but start thinking about what winter maintenance do I need to do on mowers or anything with a gas engine. So keep that in mind as well as you're putting away some of your gardening tools and things like that. All right, I just want to make sure we have no more questions too. Oh, as I say that, another one comes in. So a question about grubs. So, grubs are always really, really fun. And granted, the catch with grubs is that the best time to control grubs is always going to be in the July-August time frame, because grubs are most likely laid in that August time frame. So we like to have something preventatively down to treat them by that time frame. When you find out you have grubs now, there's very little you can do besides what I call a revenge treatment, which basically means kill them dead because you want to kill them dead. There's very little to do about them now. It's more preventative for next year. When it comes, and the problem with grubs can be, as one of the questions shows, it can bring in things like raccoons and skunks that want to dig them up, which obviously then causes even more damage to your lawn. Grubs and moles. So the one thing I will address there, moles are not necessarily attracted to grubs. So it does not mean that because you have grubs, you will have moles. There's not a direct correlation there. Moles eat a lot of other things besides grubs. They eat worms and any other insect that basically falls to the bottom of the tunnel there. Now, granted, if you have grubs, they're going to primarily chase after those grubs and maybe go into areas where those grubs are the most. But they're not necessarily digging after the grubs. They're digging after other insects too. How can we rid ourselves of grubs? Well, there are different pesticides in general you can look at. The pesticides can be both organic, or I call it synthetic. You can look at the different products that you can apply. And again, make sure you're looking of, does it say it's more of a season-long control, because there's chemistries for a longer control to hit the young grubs, and there is a different chemistry to hit the grubs when they're more big grubs, is the best way to say it. It's kind of more like our toddler year grubs. There's a different product, and those are usually going to say more like fast acting or 24-hour, results in 24 hours. Those are different. With that said, yeah, there are, products such as, milky spores, and there are sometimes other organic products that you can look at for grub control. The only catch to some of those is the fact that they may only hit certain types of grubs. So a quick lesson on grubs. There are lots of varieties of grubs. Just like if I were to say generically caterpillar. Lots of butterflies make a caterpillar. But by identifying which caterpillar is which, we know which butterfly or moth it is. So a grub is just like a caterpillar in the fact that there are several species of insects that make grubs. Japanese beetles, Schaefers, which there's a couple different Schaefers, and June bugs or our May bugs and things like that that we talk about, or beetles, those all make a grub. So interestingly enough, and I don't know who had this job, and I don't want to know how they discovered this, but the only way to identify grubs from each other, because recently we did have this come across even in my world of, people sending a picture of, hey, what type of grubs are these? The only way to actually identify which grub you have is you actually have to turn them so that, you face the inner C of them, and basically you look at what's called the raster pattern. The raster pattern is basically looking at their hind end. That's where you look at, and there are hairs there. And by looking at those hairs, there is either a pattern of like 2 lines or a triangle, or one of the patterns is there is no pattern. By looking at those raster patterns, that's how we identify which type of grub you have that matches to an adult beetle. So again, Japanese beetle, mass Schaefer, or the different Schaefer beetles. Why I bring this all up. So remember I mentioned milky spore is an option. They question, or some people do question, that milky spore is basically a strain of bacteria. Not all bacteria infect the same grubs equally is a question out there in the scientific world. So you may have to get different strains of the bacterias and try those to be able to hit all of them. It is going to take possibly time in order for it to develop in a high enough concentration to truly do a great job at controlling them. Those are all things to keep in mind. The one best organic-ish control that you'll probably be amused about is the fact that if you have a grub problem, the very first thing that I will tell you to evaluate is, do you water? So they actually have literally seen that, especially in regards to Japanese beetles, if your yard is watered, the beetle is more likely to lay the eggs in your yard, because the egg will start out, kind of moist and soft. If it is in dry soil, it will dry up and die. If it is in wet soil, it can actually continue to grow and expand better and eventually develop a larva. And they did notice in a study that if you irrigate, or if your yard is wetter, that the female Japanese beetles would choose your yard possibly over a dry yard. So what this basically, trickle down effects means. So if you have a grub problem, maybe water your yard, but in the August time frame, I never recommend completely shutting off your irrigation system, but if you would allow it to lessen and cause a little more stress to your grass during that time frame, you may be better off and have less Japanese beetles. It's not a cure, it's not a guarantee, but again, it is a technique you can try. And again, actually, you might want to start this July through August, but that obviously means you accept any other things that go along with that. Like, for example, like I said, don't immediately shut your irrigation off. That will highly stress your grass. If you've been watering very religiously before that, that will highly stress out your turf, and you do need to make sure you don't want to cause that sort of stress on top of it. So, like I said, again, I don't have a lot of other great organic-ish controls, but again, like I said, watching how you water or don't water your yard is going to be your first best suggestion I'm going to have for you. And then again, you do have milky spores as well as you do have some other treatment options for it. Only when you get very heavy concentrations of of the larva does it tend to cause these problems in your turf. But yes, they can happen. Another note, while we are on turf of things to look for, we have missed kind of a seeding window, but this isn't actually too late to fertilize. So we can do one last application. Purdue recommends that there are 4 times of the year that you can fertilize. You can fertilize Memorial Day, you can fertilize Labor Day, we do say last mow, and then you can do a midsummer one if you are watering. But if you notice, I said Memorial Day, Labor Day, so you could have gotten one in around Labor Day, and then I said last mow. So we're not quite there yet, but even though we're not there, doesn't mean you can't go ahead and do it. This is actually the time frame that if you were to put fertilizer down now, you'd be looking at something that is almost straight nitrogen, so something like a product called urea. You can put down this high nitrogen concentration, and it's not too late because basically what will happen is the grass is going to say, ooh, some last nutrition, and they will basically grab up all the nitrogen that they can and shove it in their roots. Oh, sorry for shaking the table so much to make the laptop shake. Why that's a benefit is because it will actually, because we're storing nitrogen over winter time, it will actually give you a faster and better green up in the spring than if you actually did a spring fertilizer application. What they have proven and shown is by having that kind of nitrogen over winter sitting and waiting for the plant to wake up in the spring, it will actually, I'm going to call it more gradually because of what I'm going to say next. It'll more gradually wake up in the spring. It'll be greener because it's, full of, all the stored nutrition and get growing. Whereas if you just do a spring fertilizer treatment only, it's more like that supercharges it at that time and you're going to mow more often. So again, that's why we recommend, if you're gonna, try to put your money, into an application, do the fall one. Here's another little tip. That urea is usually cheaper than a lot of our spring ones because it is, again, just straight nitrogen. So it makes it a little bit cheaper of a product, and it will go further usually than some of the other products because when you look at the bag, it may be rated at like a 4600. Well, that 46 stands for the percent of nitrogen in that bag. Or basically, if we had a 100-pound bag, 46 pounds of that bag is nitrogen. When you look at most other fertilizer bags, they're going to be in the 10 to 20 range. So you see by natural that, in your spring, if it's going to be like a 20-20-20, you probably won't find that. But if it were a 20-20-20, 20 pounds of a 100-pound bag is going to be straight nitrogen. But 40 pounds of this bag of the urea is going to be nitrogen. So again, you see you're buying less product, and it usually can be a little bit cheaper too of a product to buy. Granted, with all that said, make sure you're doing proper recommendations, and we don't recommend more than 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square foot at any certain application. But again, just realize it's not too late. You can still do this application and still benefit your lawn for the coming year. While you're looking at your lawn, do I have dead spots? Do I have some spots that aren't looking as hot as maybe I'd like for them to look? You actually have an option or two to consider. So I did say it's too late to seed with the intent to seed come up now. But in a few more weeks, or when it especially gets colder and is going to stay colder, you can actually do what's called a dormant seeding. So I can actually apply seed in like December or January and let it sit there until March or April and come up during that time frame. So we can actually do a dormant seeding. Now, with that said, it might be a little risky because the seed, if it is not properly installed, could still have a problem over winter. And the major thing you have to watch out for that is what you can also have happen is you can have it where you want to do a pre-emergent application in the spring for crabgrass. if you do a pre-emergent application for crabgrass, you're going to kill your dormant seeded seed as well as any of the crabgrass seed left too. So make sure if you're going to consider that, you do have to make sure you are not planning to do a crabgrass treatment in the spring. I see a question about the urea. So it's not a brand name I'm giving. I don't know necessarily of a brand name off the top of my head, as well as I usually don't recommend certain brands. But again, when you're looking at the bag, it's going to be usually either urea may be listed as an active ingredient. It would probably be listed as a winterizing sort of a fertilizer. And like I said, the percent or the ratio that any fertilizer bag should have, a ratio on it. Again, you're just looking for a ratio that should be something more like 30 and up numbers. So again, I am almost positive any box store or nursery that may want to carry that already has these on the shelves. So don't worry about that. I am about dead set sure you should be able to find something like that. Because yes, urea is probably more of the product or chemical. It's not necessarily a brand name of the product you would be using. So again, it's just something that would be really good to, again, try to put in. When we are talking about putting these gardens to bed as well, like I said, we're not there to the last mow yet. We have what we call typically here cool season grasses, which means they like it when it's cool. So they actually kind of shut down when it gets too far above 70s and 80s, especially the 90s. They shut down. They don't grow. That's why we don't mow a lot during the summer. So don't be thinking my grass is done growing, because no, it might grow in the 40s, 50s, or 60s still. It's not going to grow as rapidly as it would in the 60s and 70s, but I'm sure it's still growing. So you need to make sure you're watching out for that. There have been years we've mowed almost all the way into December. Don't let your grass get too long. So some people have had a philosophy of, oh, well, I cut it short this time and let it grow long this time. No. Stick with the mowing height and stick with it. So if my mowing height, was here, and then I say, well, I'm going to let it grow longer. Well, the problem is, if I let it grow longer, it doesn't actually have the roots to necessarily support that longer grass right away. So if I let it get too long, then I can actually harm the grass because it's not got the root structures to support that longer grass, as well as it would if I'd let it bend that height all along. Now on the reverse side, if this is my normal height and I let it go shorter, so I cut it back, well, then the problem is the fact that I've got all of these roots, but the grass is what provides the food for the plant. So if I go short, the problem is I have less food production that needs to feed the roots of the plant. So then roots are going to die because I don't have the food production to support my roots. So that's why you actually don't want to vary your grass heights. Now you can gradually change it if you want, but that's why you should never make a massive jump in the height of your grass, because again, you visually see the grass heights. You are not seeing those root heights or root lengths that are down below the ground. That's why we say you should never remove more than a third of the grass blade at any time, because that's when you're going to have a problem. So if your grass is just 3 inches tall, if it's 3 inches, you want to lower it. Well, you can take it down by an inch and then maybe do that gradually over time. Or if it is 6 inches tall, well, then I can remove 2 inches and get it down to 4 inches. But then you have to work it down from there, which would be like, an inch and a third. So then you're, finally back down to that 3-inch mark. But we don't want to change it rapidly and cause problems like that with our grasses as they are growing. So keep that in mind when it comes to the turf. And I can't emphasize enough how I mentioned earlier about considering, maintenance on our equipment. I can't stress it strong enough that the best thing you can also do for your yard is, if you mow your own grass, get your blades checked. If you haven't checked them at all year or for a few years, it is definitely time to have them checked. Because if those blades get dull, it actually tears the top of that grass blade. And by that tearing action, we're going to have more disease problems, or it's going to stress the plants, and we could have more insect problems come in because of that torn grass blade. So we need to make sure that you are benefiting your grass the best by not having those torn leaf blades. Now, I will say that to say, if you have ornamental grasses that do surround or are anywhere near, like in a spitting distance of your turf, some ornamental grasses will invade the turf and grow. And they make these long, stringy, grass tops that will come out whenever you mow because it's supposed to be a large ornamental grass. If you see those, that's not a sign that your blades are dull. It's just a sign that you have problems with that, I'm going to call it our lovely ornamental grass invading the lawn, which kind of makes it invasive. One grass group, the fountain grasses, have been known that, yes, they are a problem. And we do know that, and you do have to watch out for it. And I've seen many instances of that being a problem. So torn grass blades, we need to identify, okay, is it because we have an invader, or is it because I need to do maintenance on my mower? All right, is there something I can do to improve the structure, or root structure, I'm sorry, the grass? But a few spots, whole clumps come up when dogs run on it. So how we can improve the roots would mostly be, first off, fertilization. We may need to do aerations. So if we want to improve the root structures, we may need to aerate so that way we can, open up the soil profile more so that roots can grow more. Now, what concerns me is how this also says, clumps come out when the dogs run on it. What that makes me think of is, it first off makes me think of a grub problem or some other insect, maybe disease, but definitely some sort of maybe of an insect problem that might need to be investigated. Because if you do have like a grub issue, it will come up in clumps, or it can, as they say, roll up like a carpet if you have grubs. So I would be checking, to see, is that a problem, concern, or are my dogs just extra happy to be outside? Dogs in general can do damage on turf. I won't go into precise reasonings why, but female dogs are unfortunately the worst. They can do the worst damage to turf because of when they urinate, the way it happens. It's the worst thing that can happen because it's too concentrated of basically a nitrogen supplement. So keep that in mind with dogs, that we do have to watch out for those sorts of patches, that because if we give too much nitrogen in a spot, it can actually kill the turf or weaken it. So we may need to make sure we're watering afterwards or encouraging a certain area for them to go. But otherwise, like I said, if I hear of grass tearing up, number one thing I think of is going to be an insect problem. Again, grubs, or there is, and the name of it's going to avoid me right now, but there is another insect in turf that you can actually have that will basically kind of bore down into the stem of the plant, and you can then pull the rest of the plant out by its head or whatever you want to consider it as. So you do need to make sure that you are checking, okay, well, is it a grub issue because the whole plant is coming up, roots and all, kind of like almost like a sod layer, or is it just a problem because, again, there's this other insect that is actually, like I said, invading and burrowing out the stems and causing a problem. And this is all me assuming it is green grass coming out, because all those can look still green. If it's brown grass, it might be something else like diseases or something like that. But yeah, part of it is also if the grass isn't well established, that can cause it. Or the only other thing that I could think would cause it would be shallow rooting of a condition, which again, I mentioned the aeration will help, as well as watching how you water. If you are watering so that you're putting frequently small amounts of water, the roots are going to be high in that soil profile. So deep watering, like half an inch of water in one shot and only once or twice a week, is what I recommend, so that way the roots will dig down more for the rainwater and for your water, so that way you have a lesser problem with the grasses, having issues with their roots. It makes them stronger and healthier. We think we're doing a good thing by giving sometimes plants water frequently, No, it's babying them, and that causes problems. And so we really need to, watch out for that and not baby our plants more than necessary so that they'll actually grow stronger in the long run. So I'm going to do one more, I'll say last quick call. If there's any other questions, do try to get them in because we will be wrapping up here in about the next 5 minutes. So thinking about any other problems. Oh, there might be one more question. No, I did not see one about roses. So I have someone here, Peyton is my lovely helper that I appreciate so much, is helping me, and she is going to send me questions whenever she sees them. But no, I did not see a rose one. Okay, so the question, because I cannot guarantee, because I'm wearing a microphone, that anybody heard what Peyton said to me, but there was a question about roses that basically asked, hey, what about knockout roses? Do we have to be as concerned about knockouts as the other roses? Knockouts are a nice subset of roses that usually have more strengths than maybe some of our more specialty roses. What I know about knockouts is the fact that I'm pretty sure most of them are supposed to be more disease hardy, so they're supposed to be less likely to get diseases, so we don't have to do treatments of them. I believe many of them are supposed to be more winter hardy, but an ounce of prevention definitely prevents a lot of heartbreak in the future. I would probably still encourage, we don't probably have to cover the entire plant. We only need to make sure we cover a part of the plant, because as long as part of the plant survives over winter, the whole thing will survive. So if nothing else, a famous trick I did when I had roses, I went out now or when the mulch was frozen in bags at the stores, and I would buy that frozen mulch and dump it on my roses, because my theory was I would pull that back in the spring, and then my roses would be mulched for spring already. So it was actually an easy trick to pull to give that ounce of prevention so that I didn't have the heartbreak later on. But yes, research them and double check them to just make sure it's not going to be a problem if you're at all concerned. But a bag of mulch, again, it's not going to cost much, and most people are going to mulch anyways in the spring. It's going to, yes, weather a little bit over winter, meaning it'll discolor if you like a colored mulch of like the reds or the blacks or the grays or greens or whatever. The color will fade a little over winter, but it is something to still go ahead and consider doing just to make sure you don't have any problems with your roses over the winter time. Is there any other ones that got, okay, I was going to say that one must be in a different spot. It's not on my, got it. Okay, so yes, that was on a different page, so that's why I didn't see it. Awesome. So glad we still got to it though. So again, like I said, just to kind of, wrap up a little bit, and again, if there's any other last minute questions, that is fine too. But again, like I said, this is a good time of the year to kind of evaluate and see how things are going. If you have evergreens, we didn't talk a lot about those, but I mentioned a couple times, make sure you're watering those in the winter time. They really need the water over the winter time, because what we forget is our deciduous plants, what do? Drop their leaves. So they really do not lose a lot of water over winter. They still will lose maybe a little bit, but they're not going to lose nearly the amount of the evergreens. Evergreens do have their waxy coating, and they do have a waxy coating that, is supposed to help protect them so that they don't lose too much water, but they're still going to lose water and respire during the winter time because they're living things. They need to grow and survive. I emphasize the waxy coating because I know there's lots of products that you can buy, to help save and protect your evergreens. They do it naturally. They have a natural waxy coating that should be protecting them over the winter. I'm not going to say don't use those products, but just realize they already do. If they have foliage, that's part of the evergreen quality, is the fact that they're going to have the foliage that should stay good during the wintertime. But again, like I said, anything evergreen. We think about our pine trees, but heterohelix, English ivy that grows along the ground. That's not a needled evergreen, but it still stays green winter long. Boxwoods. There's lots of other examples of plants that are evergreen that, again, like I said, can benefit from watering in the wintertime, especially if they're young at all. Don't just say, oh, they're over a year old, I don't need to water them. No, I would encourage that you can do winter watering on evergreens up until they're 3 to 5 years in that spot. So why I say in that spot? Because if you've had them for 5 years and decide, no, you need to go over here instead, that restarts the clock. So you need to make sure you're watering them from the last time they were planted for at least maybe 1 or 2 winters, if not more, in order to help guarantee their success at coming back the next year strongly. I do believe it might have been a little bit of the reason why we had so much winter dieback of them this past year. I do believe you are seeing lots of discoloration of them right now from needle drops, and that's completely normal. They're dropping needles right now because they were droughty over the summer, and they always drop needles. It just looks really bad right now. But yeah, that is normal of a protective mechanism for them to drop needles so that they lose less water over the winter time. But do watch them and make sure it doesn't seem too excessive. Arborvitaes also will do it, and that really scares a lot of people. As long as they seem to be more interior focused and not all the whole branches coming out on an arborvitae, you should be fine. And especially on some of the things like white pines, I think most of them have dropped it by now. I have huge piles of now needles in my yard because we had them dropping it during windy days. So where needles would not normally fall, I noticed I have a bunch of white pine needles in my yard where they don't normally fall. But most of them have probably dropped their needles by now. But again, that's a natural process for them to go through in order to basically kind of save their hide over wintertime. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions, and it is right about at that 1 o'clock time frame. So I do want to thank everybody who's been able to join us live on this, anybody who's watching this recorded at another time. I hope you found it very informational and helpful, and to decide what to do to prepare for the wintertime with your garden, including your herbaceous plants, your woody plants, and some of your vegetables and fruits, as well as what to do with your tools. Thank you very much, and if you have any further questions, feel free to follow up with Gabis Arboretum or with myself, Nikky Witkowski, at the Porter County Extension Office. Thank you for joining us today.